Right, let me bring in Nabila Ramdani now, the journalist and Middle East analyst. Nabila, there have been claims before of the use of chemical weapons by both sides.
Yes, indeed.
Although it's hard to break down the Syrian conflict anymore into two sides, isn't it? But if what has happened is true, if what we've just heard, that 300 casualties brought in early this morning, over 1,000 dead now because of this attack, if it turns out to be true and verifiably so, what then politically do you foresee?
Well, absolutely. It hasn't been the first time we've heard claims of, chemical weapons used by the regime, and also the European Union had established a few months ago that the rebel forces had themselves resorted to such weapons. As far as the regime is concerned, the evidence has never been quite verified. Nonetheless, the international community is taking these latest claims extremely seriously, and this is reflected by the meeting in Brussels of EU foreign ministers who are supposed to discuss, at length the situation in Egypt. But clearly, the focus has shifted now on Syria, where they see that the situation is critical. The Arab League has also urged, the UN to inspect the latest claims of the use of chemical weapons extremely seriously, immediately. We've heard before the United States in particular saying that the use of chemical weapons by Assad forces would constitute a red line and therefore would justify an intervention. And this came to the fore last June during the G8 summit, where world leaders reflected on this possibility of intervening in Syria. And we heard at the time that the United States apparently gave the green light to direct military aid to the Syrian opposition, which was a clear statement of intent and would have been a huge development as the real war is concerned.
As our own Foreign Secretary William Hague has often been keen to point out, there's a difference between lethal military aid and non-lethal military aid, isn't there? Providing radio equipment and the like is very different from providing weapons.
Well, absolutely, but the Americans, it seemed at the time, were going beyond, non-lethal military aid and had pledged to help, had pledged to give the rebels the confirmed backing of the world's only military superpower, which would have put them in a far stronger position. But nothing came of that pledge, and observers and who were critical about America's response would have leveled, criticisms at the Obama administration, saying that, the number of people dying since the beginning of the crackdown would surely constitute a red line enough for intervention.
And when I was in a refugee camp in Jordan recently, speaking to Syrian men and women about that issue of intervention by the wider world, I was struck by how many of the men in particular, they didn't show any hunger to be given arms and weapons. They wanted air cover. And if this kind of attack turns out to be either routine or just happening, once is bad enough, air cover from outside forces, you can imagine, would provide some kind of protection potentially.
Well, yes, indeed. In modern warfare, surely wars are won by the control of the skies. And I think the intent of the Obama administration, when it pledged, military aid at the time, was that the initial arms supply would increase, and at some point, we might see Western air power being used against Assad, and that would introduce the possibility of a no-fly zone.
We've spoken a couple of times this week about, on air on 5 Live, about this huge exodus of people from the north of Syria into Iraqi Kurdistan. Some people have talked about being almost, starving to death because there's no food. Others have talked about wanting to flee new fighting between two different groups of anti-Assad forces. Do you think that a fear of chemical attacks will be greater and greater as instances like this happen, whatever they are, that they'll inspire fear, won't they?
Well, yes, absolutely. I think what is abundantly clear is that whether or not the Assad regime is using chemical weapons, there is an awful lot of shelling happening and people are dying day in, day out. I visited recently refugee camps myself, and I can tell you that, it's abundantly clear that they're fleeing the country to preserve their lives. And I think what some of the people have told me is that they are baffled as to why the international community is not even criminalizing Assad and his forces cases in the same way that Gaddafi had been criminalized by institutions like the International Criminal Court, for example, and that arrest warrants by Interpol have not been issued yet.
Thank you very much to both of you. That's the journalist and Middle East analyst Nabila Ramdani and Dr. Abdullah.